Welcome to the Leadership for Society series, People and Planet in the Information Era. Today I'm discussing efforts to address climate change with Secretary Ray Mabus, 75th Secretary of the Navy, U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and former governor of Mississippi. Thanks for joining us, Ray.
I really appreciate being asked, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'm going to just jump right in. As Secretary of the Navy, you championed the branch's Great Green Fleet Initiative. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. One of the things that in my lead up when I was the nominee to be secretary that really jumped out at me during all the briefings that I was getting was how energy was a potential liability. That we were dependent way too much on fossil fuels. From the very tactical, Marines were losing a Marine killed or wounded for every 50 convoys of fuel we brought into Afghanistan, for example. Mm-hmm. That's way too high a price to pay. We were refueling our ships in the Western Pacific from an oil refinery in Singapore that is owned by the Chinese. I don't particularly want to be dependent on the Chinese to refuel our warships. Right down the road was a biofuel refinery owned by the Finns. That seemed to be a much better option. So in 2009, I came up with energy goals for the Navy, the biggest one of which, by no later than 2020, at least 50% of all naval energy afloat and ashore would come from non-fossil fuel sources, from renewable resources. We are today 2/3 of the energy on our bases, our Navy and Marine bases, are coming from renewables. That's 1.2 gigawatts, enough to power a city the size of Orlando. When I left in early 2017, 40% of our fleet at sea, so sailing and flying, were coming from renewables, mainly biofuels. And so I viewed it, and still do, very much through a national security lens. This was a national security issue, and as we get into this, I can talk more about how this movement and climate change are huge national security issues and concerns.
That's great. I do want to talk a little bit more about that, but I have a couple questions about the initiative. So you started the initiative for the Navy and the Marines, and I'm curious about the other branches of the military. Did they have similar initiatives?
The Air Force had been a real leader in the early 2000s. For whatever reason, they sort of moved away from it. The Navy and Marines got way out front, and you usually don't think of Marines as ardent environmentalists. They like to blow things up, but they really moved out. They make a lot of energy now where they fight. The same with our SEAL teams. A lot of SEAL teams now are net zero in terms of energy and water and can stay out almost indefinitely. But the Army, the Air Force really began to step up. And there's a lot of friendly and sometimes not so friendly rivalries among the services in the Pentagon. But once Navy started moving out on this, it really put some impetus for them. And when this presidential administration came in 2021, you're seeing a huge emphasis now, all the way from the Secretary of Defense on down through every one of the services.
Got it. I'm curious about those tensions, both between the branches and as you think about different administrations. So how much has the shift in administration, or how much do the shifts in administration affect the kind of initiatives you're describing?
Well, I came in with Barack Obama, and I wouldn't have been there with any other president. So the emphasis the shifts are pretty big. Now, once you make that shift, for example, in the Navy and Marines, once you prove that this makes you better warfighters, once you prove that this makes you better at your job of being a sailor or a Marine or being a fighting force, it's really hard to move it out. The 2/3 of the energy on our bases, those are long-term contracts. Those are 25, 30-year contracts. And so they can't be changed. The thing that did get changed somewhat was the biofuels for steaming and flying when the administration came in after Obama. But now the administration that came in with President Biden, there's a huge emphasis on this, as you know, through the legislative act, but also in the agencies, in places like the Pentagon. And you're seeing Secretary Austin saying that climate change is one of the huge national defense issues that we're going to face. You're seeing it across government, but particularly in the Pentagon. And I'll tell you, quick story. I was testifying in front of the House Armed Services Committee early, and a congressman literally yelled at me, and he said, "You're the Secretary of the Navy. You're not Secretary of Energy. You got to quit this energy stuff." And my reply was, "You're right. I'm not the Secretary of Energy. I have more money." And the Pentagon uses 2% of all fossil fuels produced in the United States. If you move the Pentagon off, it's the largest single user of fossil fuels in the world. If you move the Pentagon off of fossil fuels, you have made a huge, huge shift, and it's really happening, and it's accelerating now.
Great. I like that story, and it leads into this next question I'm going to ask. So recently, some argue that the armed forces shouldn't be in the climate, game. They shouldn't be worried about energy consumption. In fact, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy said, if you want to make the defense budget more efficient, eliminate all the money spent on wokeism. And I would assume, that's the end of the quote, I would assume that he would include concerns about climate in that. How do you respond to those kind of claims? And how do you think about bringing along people who disagree with you?
Well, number one, he doesn't know what wokeism is. And so I don't know what he would include in it. But the way that I respond is, if you ask the military, which you should, what are the biggest threats facing us? They're going to put climate change right at the top. And here are some of the reasons, very quickly. If we don't arrest sea level rise, the largest naval base in the world, Norfolk, Virginia, is going to go underwater. And it's going to go underwater soon. Already there are king tides that used to happen maybe once a year. They're happening several times a month now, and they're flooding roads, so sailors can't get to their ships. So if you had to get the fleet to sea, you might not be able to. Number two, the Arctic is beginning to melt, and it's accelerating. It's going to be a flashpoint. Russia is already arming and militarizing things across their northern border on the Arctic Ocean. They claim that is an internal waterway. It's not. It's an international waterway, but the only way that's going to stay open is places like the U.S. Navy. And as climate change accelerates, as storms get more frequent and more intense, as droughts get more frequent and more intense, as floods get more frequent and more intense, you're going to have just whole countries, whole societies being disrupted. People are going to have to move. You're seeing immigration now based on climate change, huge numbers of people, because they can't live where they are because of floods or droughts. They can't grow food. And that descends into you. If you've got discord, it can go into chaos, and chaos can go into conflict. And the United States, particularly the Navy and Marines, are the world's first responders when you've got storms, or when you've got floods, or when you've got droughts, and you're putting sailors and Marines' lives at risk if you don't do this. So the first thing is, this is a national security issue. It doesn't matter what anybody says. Listen to the military. Listen to the military. They're the ones that are having to carry this out. Two is, I think the way you bring along people. Well, number one, I come out of politics. You said I'm a governor of Mississippi. Politics is not a 100% thing. You can win in a landslide and get 60%, and every time you walk into a room of 100 people, 40 of them are against you. So you need to act without getting everybody with you. But the way to, I think, bring people along is to show them how it affects them individually, how it affects them, how it affects their jobs, how it affects their children, how it affects their family. And I don't think we've done a good enough job in the past doing that. As we move from fossil fuels, from oil and gas production, to a much greener economy, people need to know, who work in those industries and states that depend on those industries, how we're going to make that transition. I mean, just from the charging stations alone that the Infrastructure Act did, we're going to need 1 million more electricians in this country. I mean, the charging stations, the solar, the wind, 1 million more electricians. Those are good, stable, high-paying jobs that we can transition people into. But we've got to make sure that those individuals know it. I mean, the state of Texas is a good example, big oil and gas producer, but also the largest wind producer now in the country, becoming one of the largest solar producers in the country. And, at Navy and at Marines, I faced a lot of skepticism at the very beginning. It was sort of like, why are we doing this? How does this affect us as a military? But once they saw that this was saving lives, once they saw that this was making them better at being war fighters, once they saw that this was a way to be a lot better at their jobs, it is almost an article of faith now, that this is something we have to do. And one of the things that really bothers me now is the attempt to politicize this stuff, the climate science deniers. I mean, we've got enough information. We know what's happening. I think the job now is to get the information out to the individual communities. Here's how it's going to affect your community, individual states, and particularly to individual people, that we're not going to forget you. We're not going to move on to this new economy. They're going to be better jobs. They're going to be higher paying jobs. They're going to be cleaner jobs in terms of your community, your family. But we've got to make sure that the people that are going to be the most affected on the ground know what's going on, and that there's help to do it, that they're not going to be left to figure it out by themselves.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And one of the things that we're talking about in this series is information and how it's affecting the people and planet. So you're talking a lot about climate. I'm curious how you think about the current information environment. So in that, I would include social media, 24-hour cable news. How is that affecting the types of things that you're talking about?
I think it's making us far more divided, that it makes things like this harder. It amplifies It amplifies stuff that's just not true. A lot of times it convinces people that, that, oh, there's not climate change. Oh, these increasing frequency storms and intensity storms, they're just normal. It goes in cycles. We just got to learn to live with this. But you got to deal with the environment you got. There's not 24 hours worth of news every day. There's just not. And so, social media, cable news, things like that, they're looking for eyeballs. They're looking for clicks. And so they're going to go to the most extreme, whichever direction that is. But you've got to understand that medium and that the way it's affecting people. And as you get the information out, as I'm talking about, to the individual people, you can't do it at a high policy level. You can't say, we're doing this to help. You've got to really get down to where individuals and their lives are going to be affected. And mainly that's at the community level. Mainly that's at the, individual communities, individual cities, maybe individual states. You've got to have it as a national policy. You've got to have a national push, and the funds have primarily got to come from the federal government, which they are through the Inflation Reduction Act, through the Infrastructure Act, things like that. But that's got to be translated. It can't stay at that high national policy level.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. So I'm wondering, what do you think is the most significant part of that act? It's been lauded as one of the biggest climate investments in history. What do you think is the biggest part of what was done in that act?
Well, number one, I think symbolically, it was incredibly important. The fact that we finally acknowledge not only climate change, but the urgency, the need to deal with it now, that it's not something that is somehow out there in the future somewhere, that it's affecting us now, and we've got to take action now. And if we're going to meet the goals of 2030, of 2035, we got to do a lot of things right now. And so I would have liked the act to have been bigger, but again, coming out of politics, you take a big win. You don't go for perfection. And I think that there are so many things in this act, so many incentives to make that transition to clean energy, so many things, small things like recycling, the rare earth metals that are, increasingly, that are, hence their name, rare, but that, we're throwing phones away, we're throwing car batteries away, we're not recycling them enough so that we don't have to mine as much. But I do think that now the focus has got to be on implementing, particularly the Inflation Reduction Act. It's not going to be easy to implement. It's got some amazing parts. It's got some amazing goals, but there's a lot of slip between cup and lip in things like this. And now it moves to the executive branch and to the implementation, and how do we make sure that what the law says and the intent of the law gets done. And in terms of if I think we've got the legislation, most of the legislation that we need now. I don't think a lot of the activity is going to be in the legislative realm anymore. Maybe on permitting, because that is a hurdle, and we're going to have to make permitting not less rigorous, but just quicker and easier, because you've got alternative energy projects stacked up that just haven't gotten permitted. And you're probably going to have to make permitting simpler, not only for for renewables, but also for fossil fuels. I don't have an issue with that because fossil fuels have a lot of other hurdles to jump besides just permitting.
Mm-hmm. When you say permitting, are you talking about at the level of big infrastructure projects? Are you talking about individuals like having access to solar? What are we talking about when we talk about permitting?
We're talking mainly about larger projects. We're talking about solar farms. We're talking about wind farms. We're talking about things like geothermal and things like that, but mainly solar and wind that are, and one of the real ironies, environmental activists figured out for the last few decades how to slow down and sometimes stop fossil fuel projects from going forward, drilling projects or fracking projects or whatever. Those things are now, those delays, those things that are dragging out stuff are now having a big impact on clean fuels, on clean energy. And so we've got to make sure that permitting remains rigorous, but it's just got to be simpler and it's got to be quicker so that we're, right now there are gigawatts of plans for particularly solar and wind, already have the financing ready to go, just waiting on permitting.
I see. And speaking of big projects, where are we in terms of the technologies we need to address climate change? Is there a lot more research necessary? Do you think we have the technologies necessary to address it effectively?
I think both. I think we've got the technology now, and you're seeing it. I mean, businesses are beginning to move into the lead in a lot of these things because now it's cheaper to do clean energy. It's cheaper to do solar. It's cheaper to do wind. It's cheaper to do geothermal than it is to do fossil fuels. So the bottom line and helping the world, helping climate are exactly the same. But I also think that there's so many people working now on different aspects of this. I mean, right now we're almost totally dependent on lithium-ion batteries for doing most things. Lithium-ion batteries were only invented in the early 90s. There are so many people working on different chemistries, different technologies to bring batteries, to make them longer lasting, to make them faster to charge, things like this. We have to continue that research so that maybe those rare earth metals not going to be necessary in the future. We've got the technology we need, but it's sort of like the military. You can never rest with the technology you've got today because there's always something better, and you've got to continue to put the R&D money in, the effort in, the really basic science and technology stuff that it's going to take to get there.
Mm-hmm. And given the national security issues you talked about related to climate change, what's the role of the federal government in supporting that research?
The federal government has a big role in it. I mean, the DoD labs, DARPA, Navy Research Lab, which has a bunch of Nobel Prize recipients working there. But also the national labs through the Department of Energy that do so much of the basic research and labs all around the country on university campuses that are very dependent on federal monies to make sure they do it. It's really hard for a for-profit business to put a lot of money into basic scientific research, not knowing whether it's going to pay off or not. Mm-hmm. That's a real role of government, I think, that you do help that basic research that's going to lead to stuff I mean, look, coming out of the Pentagon, GPS, the internet, flat screen TVs, all of those were started as military projects. All of those were started as basic research projects that then migrated to the civilian world. We've got to continue to do that with the energy that we're looking at.
In addition to the federal government, you mentioned states, but you didn't seem to give a high priority states, even though you were the governor of one of them. So I wonder, what role do you think states can and should play in moving these issues forward?
I think states can have a big role. You know, I really do. I didn't mean to slight states. They can make sure that it's one of the priorities in their state. They can make local permitting easier. They can make access to the research that's being done by public universities more accessible, more universally available. They have a big role to play, and I think you're seeing where you are in California. You're seeing them do it. I mean, moving to electric vehicles, and with the mandate, and before that, high mileage standards for traditionally powered vehicles. But things like that, in the 80s, states were, when I was governor, states were called laboratories of democracy. And a state like California, which is I think it's now the fourth largest economy in the world, can have a huge difference, and is making a huge difference in things like electric vehicles, but also in things like how utilities are managed. The incentives that utilities have to move, incentives and mandates to move to clean energy. The making distributed power much easier, not dependent on large plants for everything and the grid for everything, but moving to local things like that, to microgrids and community power that has the extra added advantage. If the storm comes through, it doesn't destroy it. If it comes through 50 miles away and knocks down these transmission lines. So I do think states have a powerful role to play. Aside from a few states, though it really has not been yet a priority in way too many states. I think that's changing, but I do think they should have a big and a powerful role to play.
Got it. So, I mean, in this conversation, you've been pretty positive about the direction that we're going on climate change. So the government, federal government, some states playing a large role. What do you see as the major impediments? Because there's a lot of concern that we're not moving fast enough. And you did mention that the Inflation Act could have been bigger, but what's preventing us from taking the kind of actions that you think we need to?
Number one is this politicization of the thing and denying the science, denying the basic science, and convincing people that it's really not urgent, that we really don't need to do anything, that what we need to do is the status quo. That is and you mentioned social media, you mentioned 24-hour news and things like that. That's what I see as the major impediment now. This thing is on us. This thing is not a few years away. This thing, we've got internally displaced people in the United States now because of climate change. We're going to have more. If you live on a coast, your lives may change in the U.S. This is not something that happens somewhere else. But I do think I remain optimistic because I think that I think we've reached a tipping point. The book, The Tipping Point, chaos theory, stuff like that systems tend to stay absolutely stable until suddenly they change. Mm-hmm. Usually most big systems don't change gradually. They change instantly, or, instantly meaning a few years. Mm-hmm. And I think we've passed that tipping point. I think that with business increasingly moving in these things, partly for financial reasons, but partly because they're concerned about their impact on climate. The fact that we're getting this legislation in to jumpstart it, to really give it a big charge forward, a big boost, that we're not going to do business as usual. The fact that every single forecast on things like electric vehicles are just wrong, just badly wrong. There was a thing, I think yesterday, in the news that showed the number of electric vehicles being bought. As people, you had Ukraine, you had Russia invading Ukraine, and gas prices spiking. We don't need to, our families' pocketbooks don't need to depend on autocrats, on despots invading, a free country. We shouldn't depend on countries run by autocrats for our energy security. And you cannot drill your way out of this. Fossil fuels are a global commodity. We can produce all the fossil fuels we want. But if somebody does something like invade Ukraine, or if somebody does something in the Straits of Hormuz, energy prices are going to spike. Americans are going to pay more at the gas station. And, if you are in an electric vehicle, the price of gas at a gas station just doesn't matter to you anymore. Mm-hmm. And as people are making that transition, that's why I think we're past the tipping point. Mm-hmm. And I think that this legislation, this federal legislation, has really given us number one, the symbolic impetus that we need, but number two, the very practical things that are going to make this happen. Because, as I said, things don't change slowly. Big systems don't change slowly. 120 years ago, nobody thought the automobile was going to last. And one of the things that, from my background at Navy has always led in transitioning energy. I mean, we went from sail to coal in the middle of the 19th century. We went from coal to oil in the early 20th century. We were the first to use nuclear for propulsion in the middle of the 20th century. And every time there were naysayers, including secretaries of the Navy, that said, this isn't going to work. We're trading something free, the wind, for something that costs money. Coal, we're trading coal and all these coaling stations we've built around the world for an unproven technology called oil. You'll never make a nuclear reactor small enough or safe enough to fit into a submarine. And every time they were proven wrong, and they're being proven wrong today as well. And, I also think that we've got to make sure that we look at all forms of this energy. The Navy is really good at making small modular nuclear reactors that are safe, that are incredibly safe. And, look at things like that on our military bases, because you can absolutely provide security there if that's what people are worried about. And again, those are science projects, because you got to figure out what to do with the spent fuel. You've got to, there's so much effort being put into things like that. But we got a lot of science projects out there. Some of them are going to be revolutionary and game changing.
Yeah. And you talk a lot about how it affects individuals' lives so people can understand the need to make these changes and get on board and kind of cut through the maybe I think what you're calling misinformation about climate change. And so when you think about people's lives, one of the things you said stuck out to me that some of the places on the coast may be underwater in not too distant future. And there are people who live in those cities. Like, what do you say to those people? Like, there's going to be, I mean, those places might not be livable. We need them to move within the country. What role does the government have in both informing those people honestly about the situation and then supporting what the kind of transitions you're talking about?
I don't think anybody can do it but the government. And we've got to be not alarmist, but pretty clear-eyed about what's going to happen. And, in terms of building codes for things near the ocean now, in terms of explaining what's coming, we've got way too many, videos of these floods just washing away people's homes and their lives and their existence. And what can we do to fight that? Because right now, if you live on the ocean, the only insurance you're going to get is from the federal government. No private insurance company is going to cover you. And I'm really glad the federal government's doing that. But as part of that, I think you do have to start having this conversation. There's an island in Louisiana that is going underwater right now. And it's a small island, a small number of people, but it costs about $50 million to relocate them. And, and they're losing a big part of their identity because they're having to move from where they've lived and where their family has lived for generations. And so I think you've got to begin to have these conversations with what do you think can be done? And here's how we can plan for it. Here's how we can minimize the impact on you. Here's how we can minimize the impact on this community. But we got to start having those conversations now, because when the water, I lived through Katrina in Mississippi, through where you were born in Pascagoula. When the water's up to the second floor, it's too late to be having these conversations.
And also because we talked a lot about migration and national security and how chaos can lead to conflict. And I wonder what that looks like internally, like domestically, what that looks like when you have a lot of displaced people. Do you have the same kind of concerns?
You have to have a lot of the same kind of concerns, but right now, a lot of the people coming to our southern border. You've got people who are looking for asylum because of dangers and being afraid. But you're also having climate change refugees right now coming there. You're having more coming out of sub-Saharan Africa up into Europe and the migration there. But you're going to begin to see cross-border stuff like you're seeing in Europe, particularly now. And coming up through Central America because of the storms and things like that, and the inability to make a living and to grow food. You're going to see that increase, but you're also going to see internally displaced people. We were just talking about people who live on the coast. If sea level rise continues, and there's this, frightening thing that has been in the news the last couple of weeks, that it looks like one of the huge glaciers in Antarctica is being undermined right now. It's a glacier the size of Connecticut. And if it falls into the ocean, the estimates are somewhere between 5 and 10 feet of sea level rise almost instantly.
Mm.
I mean, 5 and 10 feet, that's a lot. And you talk about affecting all sorts of places. The California coast, the New York City, all up and down the eastern seaboard, the Gulf. I mean, we're talking some really serious things here, and we can't wait until that happens to begin to, number one, have the conversations, and number two, start planning. Because if you have either gradual or very quick sea level rise, and you're beginning to have people moving away from the coast, where are they going to go? How are we going to house them? How are they going to be housed? Now, what happens if they lose their home, completely? What responsibility does the rest of the country through the government have to those people?
Mm-hmm. So I usually end this with two questions. I feel like you've already answered one of them. So the two questions are: what are your biggest fears with regards to what we're talking about, and what are you most hopeful about?
My biggest fear is that we're not going to take this seriously enough or urgently enough. We don't have much time. I in fact, don't think goals for 2050 mean very much. I think it's the goals for 2030 that we've got to do. And we've got to make sure we understand that urgency. My biggest hope, though, is particularly the generations that are coming. I have 3 daughters, 32, 30, and 22. They understand this. Their friends understand this. I think that, that there is more urgency for the people who are going to inherit this earth and for their children. I think there's a lot more urgency. And I think that is being translated into more into more focused action. I think that this legislation shows that. Like we said, it's not perfect, but it is one great start. So I don't think, I know for myself, you don't go into elective politics without being hopeful, without thinking you can make a change for the better. You sure don't go into it for the money. You sure don't go into it because it's an easy life. And I think that we are seeing now that just basic shift in people's attitudes, that this is really, really serious. There's the old line, I'm not sure who said it, but there's nothing that focuses the mind more than the prospect of being hanged in the morning. There's nothing that focuses us more than the prospect of that this could become disastrous very soon.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ray, I appreciate the talk, the sober conversation, as well as the hope. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Brian, thank you. And I really appreciate the opportunity to do this.
Great. Well, our next conversation will be on March 6th at 6:30 Pacific time, and we will explore what the future might look like given the advances in technology like AI. And the guest will be Timnit Gebru, founder and executive director of the Distributed AI Research Institute. See you then.